When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Many people think that Jesus died by crucifixion. Do you? I think in my 45 years I've heard these stories so often that I am calloused. I'm calloused to the pain and to the suffering and to the torture. I've sang the hymns and heard the stories so often that I think I'm almost as callous to the torture Jesus underwent for me as I am maybe even to my own sins that caused him to go there in the first place. You realize that Jesus' suffering began, at least in earnest, already on Thursday evening in the garden. Remember when he prayed? The Bible said that sweat dropped from his brow as though it was drops of blood. The doctors say this is actually a thing. It's documented that when people who are under extraordinary physical, and mental, and psychological stress, the capillaries in their sweat glands burst, and the blood mixes with the sweat. Already in the garden, the blood did flow. Then, of course, Jesus was arrested, abandoned. And first he went to the so-called trial by the Sanhedrin. They really didn't like him, so they roughed him up some. They beat him in the face. They demanded that Jesus testify who hit him. But beating on him wasn't enough. They had to mock and ridicule him as though he was some monster, so they spit on him. And yet these Jews were so dull that they couldn't even manufacture testimony that agreed with each other. Back and forth, Jesus went throughout the course of the night until finally he landed on Pilate's doorstep. Pilate interrogated him and figured that there was nothing really to charge him with, and so Pilate was determined to let him go free. But Pilate was afraid of the Jews. And so Pilate figured that he was going to have him whipped, Roman style, with an implement that had little beads of lead on the end of the braids, so that when that centurion rained down his blows on the back of Jesus' shoulders and back and legs, first it would just break the skin. But after as many repetitions as he took, It entered the subcutaneous level so that the veins burst. And eventually shredded the skin to the point that the arteries that fed the muscles burst forth and the blood did flow. By the time the Roman soldiers were done, his back and shoulders must have looked like ribbon. They weren't done, of course. Evidently hadn't bled enough yet. Those of us who live in Arizona are no strangers to thorns. They wove one into a crown, you see. And they pressed it down deep into his skull and hailed him as King of the Jews. And as they beat on him more, and the thorns drove down deep into his skull. The skull, you know, is the most vascular area of the human body. And the blood did flow. He hadn't eaten anything. Body was in shock from the blood loss. He was dehydrated. It's a miracle he hadn't fainted. Does this sound like the kind of guy that you should put on his shoulders 110-pound cross and force him to carry it across town to his own death? Only because Simon pitched in and carried the cross for him did he even make it. And there on Golgotha, already exhausted, now they drove nails through his hands and his feet while he lay on the ground until they lifted the cross upright so that he could hang, so that he could dangle from the nails. As his body sunk down from the cross, he was forced to try and push himself up by his feet, and you know that would rip on the nail. Cramps from dehydration shot through his whole body. Muscle spasms allowed him to lift himself up long enough so that he could speak those words from the cross upon which we meditate tonight. Today you will be with me in paradise, he said. Woman, here is your son, he said. Father, forgive them, he said. And then we read here, he said, it is finished. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. You know those words that we sang earlier from Psalm 22? I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is turned to wax, it is melted away within me. That's Jesus, you see. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. That's Jesus hanging on the cross, you see. What was it then that finally was the cause of death? A lot of people just say that Jesus was crucified. And yet that's not quite what that verse says, is it? Jesus said it is finished, and with that he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. He gave up his spirit. Death didn't take his life from him. He didn't die because of asphyxiation or exhaustion. He didn't bleed out or faint. He didn't die from dehydration. In fact, the Bible doesn't even say, at least not in this verse, that he died from crucifixion. He said it is finished, and then he gave up his spirit. Death didn't take his life from him. The devil didn't take his life from him. Hell did not take his life from him. And my terrible sin did not take his life from him. The Romans didn't take his life. The Jews didn't take his life. He looked all those monsters in the cross on that fateful Friday, and he suffered the torture and pain of it all. And then he said, it is finished. And with that, he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. He entered into death as a voluntary act of his own will, after he had defeated every other enemy. And so if Jesus enters into death as an act of his own will, I guess that means as an act of the same will, he can certainly take it back.